Okay, now that we have an understanding of how to do lighting with skylights, what I want to talk about is doing lighting with images, and that's usually referred to as image-based lighting. And when we're doing that, what we are most dependent on is high dynamic range images. So basically what that means is rather than using our sky, we're going to be using an image to light our scene, and that image needs to be a special image, meaning just not a standard image, because in order to get the power of the light, we need to make sure that it's a high enough dynamic range. So and also the next thing I want to talk about is with HDRIs is that they have to you should always make sure that you consider them when you're talking about diffuse light as well as specular light. And so now if we look at a typical HDRI, this would be an image that is actually an HDRI. You usually just see them in this form, which is in a spherical image. And that is a misconception that spherical images are actually what makes an image an HDRI. It just happens to be a spherical image because that's what makes it practical when we're doing lighting for scenes. But what the property that the high dynamic range image has that's the most important is that it basically has a high dynamic range. So what does that actually mean? Okay, so when talking about HDRIs, let's look at this in this program which is called HDR Shop, which is a program written by Paul Debevic's group. Okay, so this is your image that we just saw, but as you can see, it actually has a lot of more information in it. And what I'm actually doing here is I'm stopping up and down, and it's stored lots of different stops of the camera built into this image. And that's kind of a key factor to this, because if you look as I drag my mouse, you can see the values down here. Look in this area. It'll give you values in terms of floating point, which is another key factor, not 0 to 255, but 0 to 1 would be 1 being white. But you'll also notice that as I approach the sun area, we're actually getting values that are higher than 1. And that is kind of what we need to happen. As you remember, when sometimes we have to take our sky and give it a multiplier of 2, well, here that information is built into the image right off the bat. And that's kind of a key factor in terms of us doing this. So let's look at another HDRI. This one's one that was acquired using a Spheron camera, and it's an extremely precise image. It has a lot of information in it, and you'll notice that is this area here, which is this bloom of sun, we start to get values, higher than 1. But if I actually stop down this photograph, you'll see that the sun is actually just a little dot there, and it's just quite amazing that it's able to capture all of that information in there. So let's zoom in a little bit, and we'll see that when I actually drag my mouse over the sun, my values go in the an extremely high range, as in the 255 or more. And I've actually seen some other HDRIs which have values of 30,000 when it comes to the sun. And the reason this is low, even though it's not really low, but the reason it's considered low is because the sun is setting, so it's actually quite it's starting to dim out. But anyway, nonetheless, a great example of a very high dynamic range image, and something to keep in mind when you're actually trying to do these look at information in high dynamic ranges. So, just keep in mind that your high dynamic range image is really most important in terms of its exposure. So how do you acquire high dynamic range images? And there's a few ways that you can actually create your own, which is quite nice. And there's a great amount of these methods that are outlined on the internet. And when you go there on the internet, there's several ways you can do it. For example, this one was from a paper by Paul Debevic, and it's available online for SIGGRAPH 2001. And it basically explains the process of photographing a mirrored ball. Actually, this is a ball bearing. And at different exposures, be able to do a spherical image, and quite cheaply, basically using household appliances or household methods. And a good solid camera never hurts, of course. The The problem with this is there's generally it takes a long time to acquire the images and to assemble them, because obviously you need to assemble several exposures to create the dynamic range. But it's usually the cheapest solution in terms of doing it on your own. There are, of course, professional methods or professional cameras out there that can capture full spherical images at extremely high dynamic range, such as this Spherocam HDR. And it's a full, setup, turnkey system, which has it all built in and is extremely versatile head and that can capture basically the entire scene. And these systems are usually extremely accurate and really great because they are fully automated, but they tend to run extremely expensive, in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. So keep that in mind, that if there is a way that that you may need to buy something, it's available to you, but they tend to run very expensive. But for just users who want to be able to light with HDRIs, what you may want to try to look into as well is just looking at some online libraries. There's some great resources or great places on the internet that have provided libraries of HDRIs for people to use. And the great thing about this is that these HDRIs are ready right out of the box. You don't have to do anything usually. You just sort of place it right into your scene. And these libraries are very cheap, and there's even some free ones that you can try out. And I would encourage you to look at these places, such as this place is called SOCForm, and it's got some great libraries available. And there's another one called Dosh Design. And I would look at both of these places and see what kind of HDRIs they have available. One drawback, of course, is that it may not be the exact lighting that you want for your scene that you're trying to mimic. So at which point you would try to have to create your own using whichever method is available to you. Okay, once you've done that, there's just a little reading you can do in terms of HDRIs, such as looking at Paul Debevic's site online. And Paul Debevic is sort of, I would call him the godfather of HDRI. But Paul has written some great stuff in terms of probes and how to acquire HDRIs. And here's another link that I found that was quite useful, is in terms of transforming fisheye lenses exposures into HDRI spherical environments. And Greg Downing has done some great work as well in this arena. He has done a lot of work in terms of panoramic images, and this applies, of course, to HDRIs as well. And he's written a Gnomon training DVD on the subject as well. All right, so let's go back to 3D Studio and go back to where we started in terms of our skylight. And as you see in this particular scene, that the skylight is actually set up exactly the same way that it was in our past, and where we basically have our sky, and we have our standard materials in here, and that's about it. So what I'm going to do is, rather than use a sky, I'm going to use something else. And there's several ways you can do this. First example I'm going to do is just sort of show you. I can select this V-Ray HDRI, and when I do that, I'm going to drag it over here. I'm going to make it an instance, so I'm instancing it in this direction. And I'm going to go ahead and go in here and pick a particular HDRI that I like. And when you do that, V-Ray HDRI has a great little reader, and it brings it in. And I'm going to choose a spherical environment, and it's going to bring it in as a spherical environment, because that's it's giving you what type of angular map or what type of spherical map it is, whether it's spherical or cubic or angular or mirrored ball, etc. So, and here it's got the multipliers and the rotations and some flips, etc. And it brings in the image, and it'll use it automatically. And it'll render with that just perfectly. But instead of doing that, I actually want to try to do something else. So I'm going to start with I'm going to do a new type of material here, and I'm going to choose a bitmap. And rather than use the HDRI, V-Ray HDRI plugin, I'm actually going to use an HDRI plugin that was written by the people over at Splutterfish, which will work in any package inside of 3D Studio. So what that is basically it reads through a straight bitmap reader, but if I hit setup here, I'm going to actually select 8-bit channel. And what I'm actually doing is I'm taking my image here, and I'm making it an 8-bit image. And what's key about that is basically I'm taking out the high dynamic range because I'm going to make a point for you to see how high dynamic range images really affect your image. Okay, once I've done that, I got to make sure that I'm selecting an environment. And in terms of, it's not a texture, but it's an environment. And I'm going to select spherical. So it's going to come out pretty much the same as what I have in my other one. And so I'm going to drag this over to my GI override. I'm going to instance that instead. So now, as you see, the V-Ray HDR is no longer being used, but the other one is being used instead. So we're going to go ahead and render this, and we will see the results in just a second. So as you can see, it's now rendered it, and obviously there is some color involved, and it's no longer this blue tint, but we do have some color involved, and that's already better than our normal sky. But let's look now and see what happens when we actually take this and take our HDRI, and instead of using the 8-bit version, we're just going to go ahead and tell it to use the full 32-bit version of the read. And by doing so, we will see exactly how it is going to affect our image. So we're going to go ahead and render this one more time. And the key thing that we can notice here is that, well, first of all, I want to point out that the rendering time has gone up from about 2 minutes to about 3 minutes. And we already know the reason for that. And the reason is because there are brighter pixels and brighter light, just like we had in our skylight situation. But there's a few extra things that have started to happen as well. We're starting to notice some more interesting shadowing that's happening, and it actually get brighter areas here and more saturated areas here. So there is actually a lot richer lighting with the HDRI, and that's exactly what we're looking for. And this particular HDRI we have is a fairly neutral sky in it, but there are actually some higher range images that can provide even more dramatic shifts in light in our scene. So okay, so now that we do this, let's look at a few other things we can do to our HDRIs. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to minimize these things, and I'm actually going to go back to using the V-Ray HDRI. At this point, the difference between the Splutterfish reader and the Brazil reader is the same, because basically the V-Ray reader is only 32-bit, but the Splutterfish offered me the ability to go to 8-bit, just to illustrate a point for you guys. So now I'm going to go back to the V-Ray reader, and I'm going to actually go in here and give you a multiplier of 2 to see what that would look like. So let's go ahead and do that render. All right, so now that we've done that, we've actually able to get some very rich lighting in this area and really get some depth into these colors. But one thing to keep in mind, that you're probably never going to be able to get a really sharp shadow out of an HDRI. So if you were going to do it, and we're going to cover this later, when you're going to use HDRIs or do image-based lighting, it is generally best to supplement it with direct lighting. And that's the only way to really do it, is to sort of get together, have some direct lighting that is being used, and use the HDRI as your fill light. But the fill light sort of becomes a critical point to your whole renders. All right, now that we've covered that, let's look at a few examples of different HDRIs using this the same scene. Okay, so if you look at, for example, this is another HDRI that I've put an image here, and see how the scene is affected by that. And what I've actually done in these scenes is to actually include the HDRI as a background as well, because it helps sort of tie in where the lighting's coming from a little bit better. But anyway, this kind of gives you the idea of what's going on here. This particular one, as you can see, is a much more yellow sky, and sort of provides that sort of yellow feel to everything. And you start to see some shadowing going on here, but don't think that it's going to get much sharper than that. Here's another good one. This shows a sort of a bluer tint, actually almost a little more purple. You can start to see the purples that are going on in this area. Here's another one that's very blue, but it has a strong sort of sunset light that's coming in on the side. And finally, this one, which was the one we were looking at in the first place.